in increased development, economic linkages in the region, increased cooperation is incredibly important. But with that growth story comes challenges. We have had an order that's been predicated on a system that is now looking a little out of date, and we now have to make room. We have to come up with rules and orders and processes by which we can accommodate what is a very fast rise. It's very natural that in countries that are rising will want to find their own strategic space, their own economic relationships, expand their markets, all of which will disrupt existing relationships. And the best way we can approach some of that disruption is to make sure that we all are trying to cooperate and set those rules. But we are not going to change the direction of that. We have to work with the grain of that change and come up together with a way that we can be doing that. But it's not just geopolitics, of course, it's also the rapid, very rapid impact of technology, artificial intelligence, machine-based learning. We're having more of a discussion every day in Australia about the very future of something as mundane as work. What does a workplace look like in 10 years, 20 years? What does that mean for a population that needs income, needs to work? And all of that could change extremely fast with the impact and advent of technology. So again, another disruption, a good positive disruption, but something we're going to have to work through because things will need to be managed. And so in our thinking, in what is, because of the technology, the geopolitics, the economics, the demographic change that we're seeing, what is extremely important is that while we're trying to deal with that very rapid pace of change and do the best we can to cooperate, that we don't lose sight of some of the bigger pictures and the bigger questions. And that's exactly why it's important to be discussing a topic like we are today, and the role of education in a just society, in creating a just society. And it's the role of education that can play a very important part in anchoring us as we go through this contestation disruption, trying to inform us, trying to continually reassess, test our principles, our approaches to society, give us the creative space to explore some of these topics and come up with those new rules, new ways of adapting and equipping our populations to deal with that. So an incredibly pertinent conversation, which is also why, and I am finishing, I promise, it's my great pleasure to introduce our two discussants. Now, you'll see, I want to spend a little bit of time reading through their biographies, just so you can see how extraordinarily well equipped they are. And I'll start with yourself, Vice-Chancellor. Although I must admit, I always feel a little sad when I read through these biographies. It reminds me I haven't sort of achieved everything I set out to by my age, and especially when I start with the Vice-Chancellor, who at the age of 34 was the founding Vice-Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University, also serves as the founding Dean of Jindal Global Law School and Director of the International Institute for Higher Education, Research and Capacity Building. This is an extraordinary list of academic qualifications. I think you're sort of ticking off universities in the top 10 as we go through here, but academic qualifications from the University of Oxford, Harvard University, University of Hong Kong, University of Delhi and Loyola College. A Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, where he obtained his Bachelor of Civil Law degree. A Fellow at the Harvard Law School, where he attained his Masters of Law degree. Memorial Scholar, also at Harvard University. Awarded a Doctor of Legal Science by the University of Hong Kong, and obtained a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Delhi, and a Bachelor of Commerce degree from the College of the University of Madras. I don't know where you have found your time. I'm assuming you started studying. Areas of specialisation include human rights and development, terrorism and national security, corruption and governance, law and disaster management, comparative constitutional law and legal education. I'm assuming this isn't a mistake, but 150 publications to his credit, including 6 books, and he has been widely published in journals and law reviews in Australia, Hong Kong, India, Japan and USA. So needless to say, we'll have an awful lot to contribute to today's debate, and welcome, sir, and thank you very much for your time. And then the equally impressive, and we're very happy to have her in country, Dr. Appleby, who is an Associate Professor at the Law Faculty of University of New South Wales, Associate Dean, International and External Engagement for that faculty, researches and teaches in public law. Areas of expertise include the role, powers and accountability of the executive, the role of government lawyers and the integrity of the judicial branch. Co-director of the Judiciary Project at the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Constitutional Law. Again, widely published, and books include The Role of the Solicitor General, Negotiating Law, Politics and the Public Interest, The Tim Carmody Affair, The Australian Public Law, and again, I don't know where you all find time to do all of this stuff, but you've also spent time working for the Queensland Crown Solicitor and Victorian Government Crown Solicitor's Office. So again, I'm tired just reading through their biographies, so I'm going to finish there and hand over to our discussants who have both prepared some remarks, and then at the end of those remarks we might open up for a bit of a broader discussion. I don't know, Vice Chancellor, if maybe you wanted to go first.
Well, thank you so much, Rod, for that introduction, a very generous one. I want to first of all thank Ambassador Raj Kumar for inviting us and also allowing us to co-host this really very important discussion about the role of education in creating a just society. At the outset, I must say that both one of the interesting things I am noticing is that the two people who have been invited to discuss happen to be lawyers, Gabrielle and myself. And I'm wondering that alone has significance in India. So for the visitors from overseas and maybe even from here, let me start with something not related to the topic, but has some relation to it as well, is that I come from a place called Kanyakumari, which is and my mother is a doctor, my younger brother is a doctor. So many years ago when I decided to study law, when people came to know that I am going to study law, nearly 25 of my relatives turned up at my home in Chennai on that morning. And a middle class family, my mother is a doctor, father is a professor, so we were just, me and my brother were closeted in another room, and there was pin drop silence for the first 20 minutes. Nobody uttered a word. And then after 20 minutes, one of my uncles said to my father, "What happened? Raj was a good student." And because everybody came to know I'm planning to become a lawyer. And then the second person said, "I know he was not good enough to become a doctor, but at least I thought he will become an engineer." And the third person said that, doctors and engineers, you really need to work hard. I know he wasn't set for it, but we were hoping he would at least become a chartered accountant. And the fourth person said, "These are very difficult times for you as parents. We are with you and we are giving you full moral support." And that ended the whole thing. It took many years for me to have some respectability for being a lawyer. I say this because of the fact that that's an example of transformation of Indian society from where at least 2-3 decades ago, today some of the best and the brightest of Indian graduates across disciplines are coming into various areas of humanities and social sciences, but including law, which continues to be still much less compared to the kind of emphasis that is given in this country to medicine, engineering, as well as other areas of natural sciences. So it's wonderful that we are here together to talk about education. I'll quickly remark, I have not had a long, some sort of a paper. I'll make it very reflective and we'll have more time to discuss. I want to first of all compliment UNSW as well as Ambassador Das Gupta for choosing the topic, role of education in creating, in at least helping to create a just society. And I would like to preface my remarks by saying that education is broad, and of course there is a role for primary and secondary education, and much of what I'm going to say will focus on the role of higher education in particular in creating a just society. In fact, that itself is very controversial because governments around the world, but definitely in developing countries, are increasingly becoming more and more cynical about the investments that are being made in higher education, and are actually withdrawing and somehow making an argument that are we really benefiting by higher education? Is there real benefits to see, and see in probably in a much shorter time the investments that are being made. And in that sense, it's an important question to ask. Let me just say, to start with, that the objective or the aspiration to create a just society is legitimate and even an important objective for any society to aspire. And we also should not make a mistake to say that education should do almost everything that we would like to desire in a society. I can only say that my doctoral supervisor, a very distinguished international lawyer by the name Hurst Hannum, told me many years ago when my dissertation was on why corruption violates human rights in India and why approaches to fight corruption should be based upon human rights. And for almost the first year, Hurst challenged me that everything that is desirable need not be a human right. And then he kept on challenging me in relation to looking at why we need to be conscious of what we would call it as a right, and with that comes certain responsibilities. I say this because of the fact that as people who are engaged in policy and thinking relating to policy, it's also important for us to recognize that different institutions have different roles to play in society. While we should be mindful of the fact that higher education institutions and universities have a very big role to play in creating a just society, it is also important for us to recognize that there are other actors and other institutions within a society that has an equal, if not even a larger role to help build a just society. Now, in terms of the higher education itself, one of the reasons why the inherent, I would say the inextricable relationship between creating a just society on the one hand and the role of education on the other is not apparent is the fact that many things what higher education institutions do, particularly universities do, the results are not immediate in nature. They may not even be apparent, but definitely it may not impact society immediately. And so most of the relationship between the role of higher education has been both academically in terms of academic literature, but also in relation to policy engagement has focused far too much on applied research, on research leading to publications and knowledge creation, also even employment and issues surrounding careers and things like that, where to what extent universities and the role of higher education can play a more direct role. Rarely, if at all, universities actually in a more conscious manner ask a question to what extent the role of education, or what ought to be the role of higher education institutions, particularly universities, in creating a just society. And of course, people have answered this question in how universities can advance that, and most of that question is answered by talking about access to education, talking in terms of how do you ensure that the education is affordable, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the most important part of what I would like to reflect a bit is that education, at least higher education in particular, but also education in general, has the most important role to strengthen democracy. For all the things that both Australia and India share, one of the things that we share is that we both are deeply committed to the idea of democracy, and we are working towards, let's say, perfecting it with all the kind of challenges that come with democratic governance. So in that sense, one of the most important objectives of education ought to be to help strengthen democracy. And helping to strengthen democracy is also about developing both an informed and enlightened and responsible citizenry. And that's exactly what education does. So the heart and soul of what education ought to be doing within a society is to develop citizenry which is able to understand how laws are created, how policies are made, and how both laws and policies are impacting and how institutions are governed, and to what extent we can create transparency and accountability in those institutions. This particular goal and objective of education is something which, while universities ultimately may be doing this, it's not argued more vociferously in policy circles that this is the goal of universities, higher education institutions in the context of contributing towards strengthening democracy. The second aspect of education, at least in a country like India, is really about addressing inequalities, as well as empowering people. I mean, for all the extraordinary evolution of Indian democracy since the founding of our republic, the fact remains that we are a deeply divided society when it comes to institutionalized forms of injustices reflected in relation to our people. While we have grown significantly in terms of our economic advancement and lot to cherish about, we continue to, and of course I must say that we have particularly post 1991, regardless of different, at least India has ideologies deeply embedded in all political discourse in India, but even in that context, the fact remains that over 350 to 400 million people have been removed out of poverty in this country. A growing and an expanding middle class has contributed to new forms of imaginations among people. We are a young nation. Just imagine 850 million people in this country are less than 35 years of age. Start thinking Australia and start thinking India. 850 million people less than 35 years of age. And Indian life expectancy has increased to 75, which means that when good part of the Western world will become older, most parts of the Eastern world, including China and Japan, will become older, India will be younger and will be younger for a longer time. And I say this because of the fact that this demographic situation that we have, as some have argued, will become meaningful only if we are able to recognize the relationship between education and its objective to strengthen democracy. Because just imagine for a moment that if you have large number of uneducated people, or people who may not have opportunities to be educated, then there is the vulnerability of that society to slip into violence, to slip into, in some ways, to sort of injustices that ended up being created due to a lack of participation in the democracy, can also be our threat to the democracy or the foundations of rule of law in this country. So in some ways, the idea of higher education and of course education is to strengthen the existing mechanisms that will help us develop a better appreciation of democracy, but also to empower and create greater degree of resilience within societies. I, for one, very strongly believe that we have over time, and universities are also probably to be blamed a bit, is that the relationship between education and employment has been overemphasized, almost at the cost of other equally important relationships that need to be highlighted. While the objective of a large number of people who come into education, higher education institutions, would be and should be and indeed is to seek employment and to seek career advancement and things like that. But if you look at from a policy standpoint, from a country standpoint, the heart of that objective should be to focus on democracy and empowerment. Of course, another equally important aspect of it, which has been covered quite significantly, and invite you to read the Human Development Report of UNDP, the Human Development Index, the whole discourse relating to human development, where development is freedom, for Samatya Sen's work, and all of that was essentially focused on two critical areas. One is education and other is health. Both those factors were not adequately given attention in the previous avatar, which continues to be the world development model, where GDP and focus on trade, investment, and other sort of economic indicators dominated the social and political discourse relating to higher education or education in general. The contemporary understanding of human development puts education and health at the heart of it, and that's another significant goal of the educational system. I also want to mention that in the Indian context, maybe in the Australian context too, the thing which is far more difficult, but yet universities have a bigger role to play, is that to what extent the core values of universities as such comes at times in conflict with its objective to, let's say, build a just society. And I'll articulate a bit, and if I'm going overboard, you should stop me. Is that so? Universities are like UNSW, a world-class university, and I've always loved the fact that our middle name is global, and UNSW calls itself as Australia's first and only global university. So we have that sort of shared vision and goal and things like that. So UNSW and great universities around the world prides itself about the fact that it is engaged in the pursuit of excellence. And the pursuit of excellence is the goal of every academic institution. And it also prides itself in the fact, like other universities, that its admissions process is transparent. It attempts to bring the best of the people from around the world and from Australia itself, just as we and many other good universities in this country would do, such as my colleagues who are sitting here, Jawaharlal Nehru University, my alma mater, Delhi University, IITs and all of that, and Harvard and Stanford too. So the idea of merit and excellence becomes the centerpiece of universities for them to be truly world class. Now, of course, nobody seriously can argue about that. However, if the universities have an equally important objective of building a just society, then as academics, as thinking people, we need to ask to what extent that the objective of universities to be truly world class in hiring the best people, admitting the best students and creating the best opportunities for them potentially comes in conflict with people who may not be the best. And what happens then? Who takes responsibility for those who may not have got opportunities to be educated in, let's say, good schools, good colleges, who may not have the kind of knowledge and experience and worldview and imaginations and aspirations and goals that will enable and empower them to be the best, while universities are constantly trying to raise their quality and improve their standards with a view to seeking quality and excellence in their goals and objectives. To what extent that does come in conflict with an equally important objective that universities are conscious of, and just as Ian spoke about, the creation of a just society. Now, of course, normally this question, if you ask to universities will quickly respond by saying something on these lines, which I'm going to say as well, which is that, listen, we have a very, let's say, progressive policy, and this is something which American universities talk about it, but also others around the world, that we believe in creation of an inclusive society. We believe in diversity. We strongly want to create a society where people should have opportunities. And if you really push it hard, you might see the affirmative action policy in this country. We have reservations, we have quotas, we have a very conscious effort among universities to create a more diversified student body, faculty body, and things like that. But let me say that all of that only touches the surface. The real challenge that universities have to address is that to what extent it is able to help towards building a just society. And I must say that no university can really be absolutely confident about its work or its contributions towards building a just society. It will remain an aspiration. It will also remain an important institutional goal. The key challenge for university is to see to what extent the institutional environment, the institutional ecosystem, the vision and imagination of the institutional heads and leaders, as well as the academic and institutional imagination, it can be connected to the larger vision of universities. Yesterday we had our seventh convocation, and I spent good time talking to our students about the concept of Ubuntu, the South African concept of Ubuntu, which talks about the fact that we are part of a collective consciousness. It's almost like we are what we are because of the other, and almost the other defines what we are. And then the question then that we need to ask is that to what extent, and governments all the time speak about it, they have to speak about it sometimes, but they also sometimes mean it. But universities are slightly in a much more difficult situation when they need to cultivate a sense of recognition and appreciation of the other, the marginalized, the vulnerable, the impoverished, the excluded, and in many ways the ones which are who don't have the opportunity to be. And honestly, it's not a problem that universities alone can address. It's a larger problem that society has to address, and that's why the role of education in creating a just society becomes important. It's also equally important for the fact that higher education today is going through a very significant set of challenges in this country, but also around the world. In the developed societies, which many of us at least had the privilege of being part of in the university system, had advanced its higher education system quite significantly through enormous resources that was put into those institutions. But at the same time, over the years, the cost of education grew quite significantly. And today in the United States, but also maybe in other parts of the world, there are questions asked about the fact that, not so much in Europe, but definitely in the US, the North American vision of higher education has led to a large number of students graduating with significant debt. And to that extent, that debt and the cost of higher education has also even potentially disincentivized graduates to consider public service and the point about contribution towards helping build a just society undermined. A very distinguished political and moral philosopher at Harvard, Michael Sandel, wrote a book entitled What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, in which he talks about the fact that when our society is constantly working towards creating wealth, but more importantly, everything that we do is measured in monetary terms, the consequence of that society is twofold. One is corruption, and second is inequalities. And he talked about American society, but also he talked about countries around the world. And then the question that he asked is, and very powerful argument, is that there ought to be some things that money can't buy and markets can't define. And by the way, Michael is not a leftist. He believes in the idea of markets. He just makes an important distinction between a market economy and a market society. He believes in the idea of a market economy, but not a market society, that everything that we should do is measured in monetary terms. And the consequence of that society is which is twofold, which is corruption and inequalities, both of which affect our ability to build a just society. I want to conclude my set of remarks by saying that in the Indian context, we are obviously in a much more, I would say, at times at a very rudimentary stage of this evolution. We are facing a number of challenges. Almost everything in this country is dictated by pre-existing notions and prejudices and biases which are affecting the ability of nuanced public discourse. So we need to develop a new imagination for higher education. The new imagination for higher education ought to bring in the idea and the visions of a just society within the focus of education. We need to focus a lot more on access to higher education, not only in terms of funding and resources, which are very important, but also the kind of privileges and opportunities that people get early on. For example, in this country, one of the things you start with is the privilege to be able to speak and articulate in English language. That in itself is a huge opportunity to create an unjust society. And of course, it would be foolish to think that let's ban English language then. And that discourse also happens. So in some ways, we need to, and universities are best suited to do this because most universities have the ability to think for the long term. And in fact, I dare say Today, universities are the only institutions in the world which has the ability and even the farsightedness, let alone the courage and conviction to think about the future in more nuanced terms. Universities are also better suited to develop debate and discourse and disagree, and to even acknowledge and accept mistakes of the past, and to help build that just society. And that's why this debate ought to take place more strongly within universities. The quality and excellence debate need to be interrogated. Again, it will be a mistake to, in the British context, the Brexit debate brought out the worst in policymakers when it came to dismissing the idea of experts and expertise in understanding what really goes on in relation to markets and trade and investment and economic discourse. We need to even more be conscious of the need for having knowledge and perspectives, and develop a better understanding of what things are, and or rather what it is that we are trying to address, and how we can address that problem effectively. In India, we have always, in this country, in the universities context, private is pejorative, and we have spent the last almost half a century making us believe that why private in every context is bad. And some of us are trying to address that challenge in this country. In fact, when we opened up the higher education sector in the 90s and late 80s and the early 90s, we did not create, in higher education, we did not create Harvards and Yales and Stanfords and NYUs, which are all private universities, but we ended up creating mediocre, for-profit, dubious higher education institutions in the private sector. And over the years, the benevolent public sector institutions and universities also ended up becoming mediocre, deteriorating in terms of academic standards, quality of faculty, let alone having any serious research agenda. So we have a crisis in higher education, and both the public and the private sector have a number of challenges to address, but this challenge cannot be addressed if we see this an internal aspect of what universities are. We need to elevate ourselves to recognize the larger role and responsibilities of universities to build a just society, and also to develop a better understanding of our conceptions of what is a just society. As Amartya Sen argued about the idea of an argumentative Indian, we continue to be argumentative about these issues, and that's part of our strength. Our democracy has become better over the years in our ability to engage in this discourse, so long as some have said in this discourse, so long as we agree on the rules relating to disagreement, that we will not commit violence when we disagree. Our role and responsibility to disagree will remain the strength of our democracy. Having said that, I want to leave a thought that in the India-China discourse that many have participated, and I used to teach a course when I was in Hong Kong called Human Rights Development and Governance, and I taught that course in China too. And in my experience of teaching in China for a month and now engaging with China for nearly 2 decades, I'm fascinated by the evolution of Chinese society. But one of the things that we in India are very proud of is our strength of our democracy, our ability to disagree, our deeply embedded notions of freedom, our constitutional and legal commitment towards free speech and expression, our institutions, including judiciary and other institutions, which are all free and are able to express and do things, so the question then I have begun to ask is that we are indeed free, and we can say anything we want, and in China you can't. Then as thinking people that we need to ask is that while we can say anything we want, is anybody hearing? Are we being heard? And that's a question which democracies need to ask. And the question of being heard is not only a question of education, but it's also a question of justice. The heart of higher education institutions should be to make a commitment towards not only building a just society, but also developing a sense of justice. When we can move towards achieving that sense of justice, we will be closer to achieving the ideals of democracy that we both share. I want to end by saying that it's a pleasure to begin this journey of the inauguration of the UNSW Center here in India. I have always lamented for many years that Australia need to have a stronger presence in India. I have been saddened over the years that Australia does not have an intellectual imagination and an intellectual presence in India, while most governments tend to look at the India-Australia or any relationship between two countries in the prism of trade and investment. It's important that we go beyond that. And when Gabrielle visited us last time, and I've had this conversation with Ambassador Raj Kumar as well as Ian and Laurie and others in UNSW, I feel that the opportunity for Australia to do more than what it has ever done in India is real, and it is phenomenal. And on a rather non-diplomatic note, I will say that Brexit and Trump are key indicators, or rather key unique strategic advantages that Australia possesses right now. But Australia will potentially lose its opportunity in India if it looks at India from the prism of what China is, what any other country is. India is an extremely complex society, extremely diverse society, and there is so much layers and layers of complexity deeply embedded in this country, and you need to look at India engagement at a much broader level. And for Australian higher education system and Australian higher education institutions to be seen at a much more, not just positive manner, but a much more, I would say, responsible manner in India requires a significant number of deep and pervasive partnerships. I must say that you have got an extraordinary leader in Ambassador Das Gupta, a champion of the India-Australia relationship, the UNSW and other Indian universities relationship. He is tirelessly working to create a stronger presence of Australia in India, and we all need to do our bit in this because, as I said before, there have been mistakes made in the past, and we need to correct those mistakes. The mistakes that happened in 20 years ago, looking at seeing Australian universities in India from the standpoint of export of education. I think we need to develop new terminologies. I am very uncomfortable with the use of industry and business and contribution to economy in monetary terms and all of that. All those terms have to change because you're really talking about human capital, and the challenge of that discourse is most of the time we can never calculate and we can never really measure what counts in this. And so our inability to measure what really counts in society is what a university does. And I would appeal to the policymakers that we start measuring the impact of universities not only in terms of its foreign revenues and foreign direct investment and inward inflow of money into economies and income. Far too long we have made that mistake, even within the context of Australia's presence in India. We need to change the discourse. If we don't change the discourse, we will not only be making a mistake about the opportunity, but we will be far away from helping the universities fulfilling the role of building a just society. I want to stop here and thank you for your patience. Sorry that I might have taken more time.